Hello, this video is going to be on Algebra 2 topic, I.4, factor using a quadratic pattern. Now, in this topic, we're going to be factoring these polynomials completely. And that word completely is important because we might have to factor it multiple times. All right, so let's go ahead and think about this for a second. Whenever we have a trinomial, we're likely going to be factoring it down into a binomial, at least to start, and then see if we can factor it any further because of this word completely. So how would we factor this? Well, I see an x to the fourth power here. So it gives me a sign that my first terms are going to be x squared, because x squared times x squared would give me that x to the fourth power, right? Now, my next clues are this pattern right here. You see how this 2x squared and this 1, you see how this b value is twice of this c value right here? Remember, this is our a would be 1, our b would be 2, and our c would be 1. You see how this is double of this? This is a pattern where I can see that if I had positive 1 here, this would actually be true, because 1 times 1 is 1, and then 1x squared plus 1x squared is 2x squared. So you'll see this pattern kind of repeat. That's why this is called factor using quadratic patterns. So if this number here is the is twice of this number here, and you know that it's a perfect square, then we can write this out. Now, x squared plus 1 times the quantity x squared plus 1 can also be written x squared plus 1 quantity squared, right? Because it's this whole thing times itself twice. So that's how it would like you to write it here, if you can write it with a square, just because that's a simpler way to write it. So parentheses x to the power of 2. Hit the right arrow to make sure you're not writing in the exponent anymore. Plus 1, parentheses, to the power of, and we can also do shift 6 to do the shortcut. So x squared plus 1 quantity squared. Okay, let's find a different pattern. So let's look at this one. This fits the same pattern as before. We're factoring x to the fourth power. So that's x squared times x squared. And then here you see it's 64. So 64 is 8 squared, right? And 8 plus 8 would be 16. So in this case, we have a positive 8 here. So the same idea, right? Since it's the same quantity times itself, since there's two of these, we can just write our answer as parentheses x squared plus 8 quantity squared. Okay, this one's very similar, so I'm going to skip past it. Let's find a different one. Okay, this one's a little different. So this one's different because you see how this is a negative value? So let's go ahead and let's think, how could I factor this down, okay? Now, there still has this x fourth term, so, x to the fourth power. So you would still have x squared times x squared, right? And now what number, since I'm doing since I have a positive 1 and a negative 2, remember when we factor, we think, what do we multiply to make the c value that when we add makes this negative 2, right? So that would be a negative 1, because negative 1 times negative 1 is 1. Negative 1 plus negative 1 is negative 2. So what I would put here is minus 1. See that? Okay, so now this can actually be factored a little bit more. So if you think about it, x squared minus 1 is actually the same thing as x plus 1 times x minus 1. And I can show you that because let's just show what happens when we multiply this out, right? X times x would be x squared. X times negative 1 would be negative 1x. But then when we do 1 times x, that's positive 1x, right? Negative 1x and positive 1x, those cancel out. And then when you do positive 1 times negative 1, you get negative 1. Do you see how this is the same thing? So when you break this down and you factor x squared minus 1, you actually can factor it down into x plus 1 times x minus 1. And since this is the same thing, we can also factor that down into x plus 1 times x minus 1. Right? Now, we could write this whole thing a little bit more simply, right? Because if you notice, there's two x plus 1s. There's one here and one here. So we can just write that as x plus 1 quantity squared. And then there's two x minus 1s. There's this one and there's this one. So we can write that as x minus 1 quantity squared. Okay? So basically, if there's a minus and you have a perfect square here, you can continue to factor it down a little bit more. So let's go ahead and write that in. I don't think it matters the order, x plus 1 squared, or you could do x minus 1 quantity squared. And that pattern repeats whenever you have a negative b value, like the -2 right here, like that. Okay, so let's try this one. So we have x to the 4th power, which is how we know we have an x squared. X squared times x squared would give us x to the 4th. And then we want to see, okay, so what values would we multiply to make 9 that would add to make -10? Well, since they make a positive when you multiply, but when they make a negative when you add them, these must both be negative. And what fits here is -1 and -9. So these factors are -1 and -9. Now these can both be factored down, right? We just saw how this factors down into x plus 1 times x minus 1. And in the last problem, we showed why that can be factored that way. But think about it, this follows the same pattern, right? Except this is a 9, not a 1. So what times itself makes 9? And that is 3. So this we can rewrite as x plus 3 times x minus 3. Now, since none of these things in parentheses are the same, we can't just simplify them and write squared. We have to write all of these factors here. So this would just be x plus 1 times x minus 1 times x plus 3 times x minus 3. Okay, this is very similar. Let's keep going. And let's see if the challenge zone is every different. All right, let's do this last one. So here, same start, x to the 4th power. So how do we get that? X squared times x squared. And then let's think, what do we multiply to get -72? That when we add, we get negative, this is just x squared, so -1. Let's see, the two numbers that are 1 apart that make -72 are 8 and 9. And since this is negative, when you add them together, you need the larger one to be negative, right? -9 plus 8 makes -1, and if you multiply them, you get this. So the two numbers that go here are +8 and -9. Now this first term right here, this binomial doesn't follow that pattern, right? But this one does. So this x squared plus 8 is already factored as much as it'll go. But this will break down into x plus 3 times x minus 3, as we saw in our last problem. So you should be able to write this in any order, but this is how you can factor it down as much as possible. And just make sure that you write your answer really carefully and you don't put too much in the exponents. Let me show you a common mistake. X squared. A lot of people will write plus 8, right? You see how that's still in the exponent? Make sure that it's not up there. You have to write it down here, plus 8. And then x plus 3 and x minus 3. All right, good luck with this topic. I hope that you have the skills you need to do it now.